strange historians. Strange historians.
Picture this. You're standing in the marble corridors of a Macedonian palace, about to witness one of the most chilling wedding ceremonies in ancient history. The linen robes feel rough against your skin as you watch a woman adjust the golden diadem that marks her as queen. Her hands shake, not from fear, but from rage that she must swallow like bitter wine. Through the marble columns of the palace at Pella, you can see the Macedonian nobles gathering in the courtyard below, their voices rising in celebration of what they believe to be her triumph. If only they knew the truth. You're watching Arsinoe, too, one of the most powerful women of the ancient world, as she marries her own half-brother, Ptolemy. They call him Cyrannus, the thunderbolt, for his swift and brutal ambitions. He stands beside her, his arm possessively encircling her waist. His grip is too tight, his smile too sharp. The wedding crown he placed upon her head moments ago looks like a shackle. He promised her safety for her sons, promised to acknowledge them as heirs to his stolen throne of Macedonia. But you can see the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger that drove him to murder Seleucus and seize these lands. You know what he truly wants, not a wife, but the elimination of rivals. Her 3 sons from her first marriage represent threats to his rule, and despite his honeyed words, can almost smell the blood already on his hands. The priests chant in Greek, invoking Zeus and Hera to bless this union. How ironic, those divine siblings whose marriage the poets sing of, while the assembled nobles pretend not to see the revulsion in her eyes. This is not the first time she has been traded like a precious gem to secure an alliance. Her father, Ptolemy, handed her to Lysimachus, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Now, at 40, she is currency once again. Watch as the wine tastes like ash in her mouth while they perform the ritual toasts. Around them, the court celebrates, but she is already planning. She has learned anything in the 25 years since she first stepped into the treacherous waters of Hellenistic politics. It is this: survival requires more than beauty or bloodline. It requires cunning, patience, and the willingness to do whatever the gods demand, as Cyrannus raises his cup to toast their blessed union. You catch sight of her eldest son, Ptolemy, in the crowd. Unlike his younger brothers, he refused to come to Pella, sensing the trap that she, blinded by desperation, walked into willingly. His absence may yet save his life, while hers hangs by the thinnest of threads. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. She, Arsinoe, daughter of the great Ptolemy Soter, carved an empire from the dying breath of Alexander's conquests, has become the very thing her enemies claim all royal women become, a pawn in the games of men. But they underestimate what a pawn can become when she reaches the other side of the board. The ceremony concludes with kisses that taste of poison and promises that ring hollow as broken pottery. Tonight, as Macedonia celebrates its new queen, she will sleep beside a man who sees her only as a stepping stone to legitimacy, who views her children as obstacles to be cleared away. But he does not know who he is truly married to. He does not know that the blood of Alexander's successors runs in her veins, or that she has survived courts more treacherous than his, or that she has already begun to weave the web that will either save her or destroy them all. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering in the shadow of the pyramids, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths behind history's most powerful dynasties, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the price of power and the women who paid it. The story of Arsinoe, too, begins not with love or even desire, but with the cold mathematics of empire. born around 316 BCE in the gleaming new city of Alexandria. She entered a world where bloodline was both privilege and prison. Her father, Ptolemy the First Sotar, was one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, a man who had helped carry the world conqueror's body from Babylon and then carved out his own kingdom from the chaos that followed. In the marble corridors of the Ptolemaic palace, young Arsinoe would have learned early that her beauty was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty. Her father's second wife, Bernice, had already proven that a woman could rise from relative obscurity to queenship through charm and cunning. But even as Bernice whispered stories of goddesses and heroines into her daughter's ear, the reality was harsher. In the world of the Diadochi, Alexander's successor's daughters were diplomacy made flesh. The Alexandria of Arsinoe's childhood was a city drunk on possibility. The great library was taking shape, drawing scholars from across the Mediterranean, like moths to a flame. Ships from India and Arabia crowded the harbor, their holds filled with silk and spices and ivory. But beneath the marble facades and philosophical debates, the city thrummed with the constant tension of a dynasty still proving itself. The Ptolemies were Greeks ruling Egyptians, Macedonians playing at being pharaohs, and every day brought fresh challenges to their legitimacy. Arsinoe grew up bilingual, speaking Greek in the palace, but learning Egyptian from the servants who raised her. She would have watched the daily rituals in the temple precincts, seeing the priests perform ceremonies that stretched back 3,000 years. Even as a child, she understood that Egypt was different from the other Hellenistic kingdoms. Here, the king was not just a ruler, but a god, the earthly embodiment of divine power. And gods, as every Egyptian knew, had their own rules about marriage and bloodline. The priests told stories of Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings whose union had created the cosmic order. Isis, the great mother goddess, had married her brother Osiris, the lord of the underworld, and their love had become the foundation of Egyptian religion. To the native Egyptians, sibling marriage among the gods was not scandalous, was sacred. But to the Greeks, it was an abomination that violated the natural order. When Arsinoe was 15, her father made the decision that would define her life. The year was 301 BCE, and the Diadochi was still fighting over the remnants of Alexander's empire. Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, needed allies against his rivals, and Ptolemy the First needed to secure his eastern borders. The solution was simple: marriage. Lysimachus was 55 years old, a grizzled veteran who had fought beside Alexander from the Danube to the Indus. His body bore the scars of 100 battles, including the famous encounter with a lion that had given him his nickname, Too Young Arsinoe. He must have seemed like a figure from legend, terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. The wedding was held in the ancient city of Sardis, once the capital of the Persian Empire. Picture the scene: the great hall filled with nobles from across the Greek world, their voices echoing off the gold-leafed walls. Arsinoe stood in robes of Egyptian linen dyed with Tyrian purple, her dark hair crowned with a diadem that caught the light of 1,000 oil lamps. She was beautiful in the way that teenage girls are beautiful all potential, and promise her eyes, bright with intelligence and carefully hidden fear. Lysimachus placed the ring upon her finger with hands that had once held Alexander's stirrup. He spoke the ancient words of the Greek marriage ceremony, but his eyes were already calculating. This was not a union of hearts, but of armies, not a romance, but a treaty written in flesh and blood. As they shared the ceremonial wine, Arsinoe tasted her future, bitter and intoxicating in equal measure. The wedding feast lasted 3 days. Poets recited verses comparing the bride to Helen of Troy and Penelope the Faithful. Musicians played harps and flutes, while dancers from across the empire performed for the assembled nobles. But beneath the celebration lay the harsh reality of what this marriage meant. Arsinoe was no longer just a princess of Egypt. She was now a queen of Thrace, a player in the deadly game of Hellenistic politics. Her new husband's court was a dangerous place. Lysimachus had ruled for over 2 decades, but his kingdom was surrounded by enemies. To the north, the Thracian tribes pressed against his borders, their warriors hungry for Greek gold. To the east, the Seleucid Empire stretched from Anatolia to India, its king Seleucus I constantly probing for weakness. To the south, the other, Theodochi, watched and waited for any sign of vulnerability in this environment. Arsinoe learned the first great lesson of her life. Survival required more than beauty or charm. It required the ability to read the currents of power, to understand when to advance and when to retreat, when to speak and when to remain silent. She watched her husband's courtiers with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey, learning to decode the subtle signs of alliance and betrayal. Within a year, she was pregnant. The child, a son they named Ptolemy, was born in 299 BCE, and his arrival changed everything. Suddenly, Arsinoe was not just a wife, but a mother, not just a queen, but the founder of a potential dynasty. 2 more sons followed in quick succession: Lysimachus in 297 BCE and Philip in 294 BCE. Each birth strengthened her position at court, each child a hostage to fortune and a weapon in the game of royal succession. But Lysimachus already had an heir, his son Agathocles, born of his first marriage. As Arsinoe's sons grew from infants to toddlers to young boys, the question of succession began to dominate court politics. Who would inherit the kingdom? The older son, born of a commoner, or the younger sons born of a princess of Egypt? The whispers started slowly. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the Egyptian queen's ambitions. Nobles divided into factions, some supporting Agathocles, others beginning to see opportunity in the younger princess. Arsinoe found herself at the center of a web of intrigue that grew more complex with each passing year. She began to understand the true nature of her position. She was not just a queen, she was a foreign queen, a woman whose loyalty was always suspect. His children represented a threat to the established order. The court that had welcomed her with celebration now watched her with suspicion. Every word she spoke was analyzed for hidden meaning, every gesture interpreted as a sign of plotting. The pressure was enormous. Imagine being a young woman in her 20s, far from home, responsible for 3 small children, surrounded by enemies who smiled to her face and plotted poison behind her back. The weight of expectation pressed down on her like a physical force. Her father had invested Egypt's future in this marriage, and failure would mean more than personal disgrace, would mean the weakening of the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. So Arsinoe learned to play the game. She cultivated allies among the court ladies, using her Egyptian gold to buy loyalty. She patronized philosophers and poets, creating a circle of intellectuals who praised her wisdom and beauty. She participated in religious ceremonies, showing respect for the local gods while maintaining her own Egyptian practices. And slowly, carefully, she began to build a power base independent of her husband. The crucial moment came in 283 BCE, when Arsinoe's eldest son Ptolemy reached the age of 16. By Greek custom, he was now old enough to be considered for the succession. The question could no longer be avoided. Who would inherit Lysimachus' kingdom? The old king was now 73, his hair white as snow, his step no longer steady. He had ruled for 39 years, longer than Alexander had lived, and the weight of those decades showed in every line of his face. But his mind remained sharp, and he understood the choice before him: support his eldest son Agathocles and risk alienating his powerful Egyptian allies, or support Arsinoe's sons and risk civil war with Agathocles supporters. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. Some claim that Arsinoe seduced her husband into eliminating his rival. Others argued that she simply presented him with political realities he could not ignore. The truth, as always in these ancient stories, was probably more complex than either version. What we know for certain is that in 283 BCE, Agathocles was arrested on charges of treason. The evidence against him was in a few intercepted letters, some suspicious meetings, the testimony of witnesses who may have been bribed or coerced. But in the world of Hellenistic politics, the appearance of guilt was often enough. Within days, Agathocles was dead, executed on his father's orders. The court reeled from the shock. Agathocles had been popular among the nobles, a proven military commander who had fought beside his father in numerous campaigns. His execution sent a clear message. Arsinoe's sons were now the heirs to the throne, and anyone who opposed them did so at their peril. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Agathocles' death split the kingdom, creating factions that would never truly reconcile. Many of the old nobles, the men who had served Lysimachus since the beginning, now saw Arsinoe as a foreign sorceress who had corrupted their king. The whispers grew louder, more venomous. She was called a second Medea, a woman who would destroy everything she touched in pursuit of power. The external enemies of the kingdom sensed weakness. Seleucus, the last of Alexander's original bodyguards, began to move against Lysimachus' eastern territories. The Thracian tribes pressed harder against the northern borders. Pirates raided the coastal cities. Knowing that the kingdom's attention was focused inward on its own divisions, in 281 BCE, the crisis came to a head. Seleucus invaded Anatolia with a massive army, claiming to avenge the death of Agathocles. Lysimachus, despite his age, took the field one last time. At the Battle of Corupedium, the two old men, both now in their 70s, faced each other in what would be the final confrontation of their generation. The battle was a disaster for Lysimachus. His army, weakened by years of internal strife, crumbled under the Seleucid assault. The old king himself fell in the fighting, his body pierced by a dozen spears. With his death, the kingdom of Thrace collapsed like a house built on sand. Arsinoe, now a widow at 35, found herself in the most dangerous position of her life. She had 3 young sons to protect, but no army to defend them. The kingdom her husband had built was dissolving around her, torn apart by ambitious generals and vengeful nobles. Seleucus was advancing on the capital, and there was nowhere to run. But Arsinoe had not survived 20 years of court intrigue by being passive. Even as the news of her husband's death reached her, she was already planning her next move. She gathered her most loyal supporters, secured what treasures she could carry, and prepared to make her escape. The woman who had once been carried to Sardis in a bridal litter now faced the prospect of fleeing for her life. The irony was bitter. She had played the game of power as well as any man, had sacrificed her stepson to secure her children's future, had endured decades of suspicion and hatred, and now, in the moment of crisis, she found herself with no choice but to run. The journey to safety was harrowing. Picture a royal caravan moving through the night, torches flickering in the darkness, the sound of horses' hooves muffled by the sand. Arsinoe rode with her 3 sons, Ptolemy, now 17, Lysimachus, 15, Philip, 12. They were no longer princes, but refugees, their royal robes exchanged for the rough clothes of travelers. Behind them, the kingdom burned. Seleucus had taken the capital, and his soldiers were methodically hunting down anyone connected to the old regime. Arsinoe supporters were being executed or enslaved. The cities that had once celebrated her arrival now opened their gates to her enemies. But Seleucus himself would not live to enjoy his victory. Even as Arsinoe fled westward, another drama was unfolding. Ptolemy Soranus, her half-brother, son of her father's first marriage, had been living in exile at Seleucus' court. The old king had promised to help him regain his birthright, to install him as ruler of Macedonia. But Cyrannus was impatient, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. At the very moment of triumph, as Seleucus prepared to cross into Europe, Cyrannus struck. He murdered his host and benefactor, claiming the army and the throne of Macedonia for himself. The last of Alexander's original companions was dead, killed by a man young enough to be his grandson. The news reached Arsinoe as she sheltered in a harbor town on the Aegean coast. Her half-brother, the man who had been passed over for the succession in Egypt, who had nursed his grievances in foreign courts for decades, is now king of Macedonia, and he was offering her marriage. The proposal was delivered by a messenger who spoke in honeyed words about reconciliation and family unity. Cyrannus promised to acknowledge her sons as his heirs, to give them the kingdom that Lysimachus had lost. He spoke of love and destiny, of the need for the Ptolemaic bloodline to rule in Macedonia as it ruled in Egypt. Arsinoe listened to these words with a face like stone. She had heard such promises before from Lysimachus, from countless courtiers and generals. She knew the weight of royal promises, knew how quickly they could be forgotten when convenience demanded it. But she also knew that she had no choice. Her sons needed protection, and she needed a throne from which to provide it. The decision to accept Cyrannus' proposal was the most difficult of her life. She was not a naive girl this time, but a woman of 40 who had seen the full horror of what men could do when power was at stake. She knew that marrying her half-brother was a desperate gamble, that she was walking into a trap with her eyes wide open. But what choice did she have? To refuse would mean perpetual exile, a life of wandering from court to court, watching her sons grow up as pensioners dependent on others' charity. To accept meant risking everything on the hope that blood might mean something, that family ties might prove stronger than political calculation. As she prepared to leave for Macedonia, Arsinoe made one final decision. She sent her eldest son Ptolemy away to the court of a distant ally. If disaster struck, at least one of her children might survive to carry on the bloodline. It was a mother's wisdom, born of bitter experience and desperate love. The wedding took place in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia. In the shadow of the palace where Alexander had been raised, the ceremony was magnificent. Cyrannus spared no expense in demonstrating his legitimacy, for underneath the gold, in purple, the music and dancing lay the cold reality of political necessity. As the priests performed the ancient rituals, they were children of the same father, but different mothers, products of Ptolemaic multiple marriages. In Egyptian tradition, such unions were not only acceptable but sacred, a reflection of the divine marriages that maintained cosmic order. But to the Greeks, there was something unsettling about this match, something that spoke of desperation rather than destiny. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, but the honeymoon was measured in hours. Cyrannus revealed his true intentions. He had married Arsinoe not for love or even political alliance, but to eliminate the threat her sons represented. With her safely in his power, he could deal with her children at his leisure. The betrayal was swift and brutal. Cyrannus' soldiers surrounded the palace quarters where Arsinoe's 2 younger sons were staying, the boys Lysimachus and Philip, aged 15 and 12, were dragged from their beds and murdered in front of their mother's eyes. Their blood stained the marble floors of the palace where Alexander had once played as a child. Arsinoe's screams echoed through the halls of Pella, a sound that would haunt the palace for generations. But her grief was a luxury she could not afford. Even as her sons' bodies were being dragged away, she was planning her escape. The woman, who had survived 2 decades of court intrigue, was not about to let this betrayal be her end. She had learned from her father's example. Ptolemy had escaped from impossible situations by being faster and more ruthless than his enemies. Now, as guards watched her every move and servants reported her every word, Arsinoe began to plot her own survival. The escape was worthy of a novel. Using loyal servants and the underground network of slaves and freedmen that existed in every palace, she managed to slip away from Pella in the dead of night. She was disguised as a servant, her royal robes exchanged for rough wool, her jeweled diadem replaced by a simple headscarf. Behind her, she left a decoy slave woman who bore a passing resemblance to the queen, who would buy precious hours before the deception was discovered. The journey to safety was a nightmare of narrow escapes and hidden dangers. Soldiers were everywhere, searching for the woman who had humiliated their king by escaping his trap. Arsinoe moved through the shadows, helped by a network of supporters who risked their lives to shelter her. Some were motivated by loyalty, others by gold, but all understood that they were participants in a drama that would be remembered for centuries. Her destination was the island of Samothrace, a sacred place where the ancient mystery religions offered sanctuary to those who sought it. The island's temples were protected by customs older than the Greek cities, older than the Macedonian kingdom. Even Cyrannus would not dare violate the sacred precinct of the great gods. As her ship approached the rocky shores of Samothrace, Arsinoe must have felt the full weight of her losses. She had been married 3 times, borne 3 sons, ruled as queen of 2 kingdoms. Now she was a refugee, dependent on the charity of priests and the protection of ancient laws. 2 of her sons were dead, murdered by her own half-brother. The third was in exile, his future uncertain, but Arsinoe was not a woman to be defeated by disaster. Even as she grieved for her lost children, she was already planning her next move. She had 1 card left to play, one last chance to rebuild her life and secure her legacy. Her youngest brother, Ptolemy II, now ruled Egypt as pharaoh. She could reach Alexandria. If she could convince him to take her in, she might yet find a way to survive. The journey from Samothrace to Alexandria was fraught with danger. Cyrannus's ships patrolled the northern Aegean, while pirates infested the southern waters. But Arsinoe had learned to be resourceful, to use every advantage available to her. She traveled in disguise, sometimes as a merchant's wife, sometimes as a pilgrim seeking religious instruction. Her beauty, once her greatest asset, is now hidden beneath rough clothes and careful makeup. When she finally reached the harbor of Alexandria, the city of her birth, she must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. This was home, but it was also the place where her exile had begun 40 years earlier. The palace where she had played as a child was now ruled by a brother she barely knew, a man who had been an infant when she was married to Lysimachus. Ptolemy II Philadelphus was 36 years old, a scholar and administrator who had inherited his father's kingdom, but not his military genius. Egypt was prosperous under his rule, its trade routes secure, its temples magnificent, but the pharaoh himself was a cautious man, unwilling to take the risks that had made his father great. The reunion between brother and sister was awkward, charged with decades of separation and mutual suspicion. Arsinoe was no longer the young princess who had left Alexandria in a bridal litter. She was a woman hardened by tragedy, scarred by betrayal, desperate for a second chance. Ptolemy II saw in her both an opportunity and a threat, a sister who might be a valuable ally, or a rival who might challenge his authority. The negotiations were delicate. Arsinoe needed sanctuary, but she also needed a role worthy of her experience and ambition. She could not simply retire to a comfortable exile. She could not accept the life of a dependent relative. She had been a queen, a mother, a player in the great game of power. She would not be content to fade into obscurity. The solution, when it came, was as shocking as it was brilliant. Ptolemy II was married to Arsinoe, a woman who had given him children, but who lacked the political acumen to be a true partner in rule. If he were to divorce his wife and marry his sister, he would gain not just a queen, but a co-ruler, someone who understood the complexities of Hellenistic politics as few others did. The idea of sibling marriage was not new to Egypt. For 3,000 years, the pharaohs had occasionally married their sisters, following the example of the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris, the divine couple who ruled the underworld, were brother and sister. Their union was not seen as incestuous, but as sacred, a reflection of the cosmic order that kept the universe in balance. But the Ptolemies were Greek, and to the Greeks, sibling marriage was an abomination. It, the natural order, offended the gods and threatened the stability of society. No Ptolemaic ruler had ever married a full sibling, though they had occasionally married half-siblings or cousins. The decision to break this taboo was not made lightly. Ptolemy II understood that he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, that he was setting a precedent that would define his dynasty for centuries to come. But he also understood the advantages. By marrying Arsinoe, he would be following the example of the pharaohs, claiming the divine authority that came with sacred marriage. He would be demonstrating that the Ptolemies were not just Greek kings ruling Egypt, but true pharaohs, inheritors of the most ancient traditions. The announcement of the engagement sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Poets and philosophers debated the morality of sibling marriage, while politicians calculated the implications for their own kingdoms. Some saw it as a sign of Egyptian decadence, proof that the Ptolemies had been corrupted by their foreign subjects. Others recognized it as a masterstroke of propaganda, a way of claiming legitimacy that no other Hellenistic dynasty could match. The wedding itself was a magnificent affair, designed to emphasize the divine nature of the union. The ceremony took place in the great temple of Ptah in Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, where pharaohs had been crowned for millennia. The rituals were Egyptian rather than Greek, emphasizing the sacred nature of the marriage and the divine status of the couple. Arsinoe, now 41 years old, stood beside her 26-year-old brother as the high priest of Ptah performed the ancient ceremonies. She wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the symbol of pharaonic authority that had been worn by rulers since the time of Menes. Her brother wore the traditional regalia of a pharaoh, the crook and flail that symbolized his role as shepherd of his people. The hymns sung that day were ancient beyond reckoning, texts that had been old when the pyramids were built. They spoke of divine marriage, of the union between earth and sky, between order and chaos. They proclaimed that the royal couple were no longer merely human, but had become gods, worthy of worship and veneration. The Greek inhabitants of Alexandria were scandalized, but they were also awed. They had never seen anything like this ceremony, had never witnessed the full pageantry of pharaonic religion. The Ptolemies had always maintained a careful balance between their Greek and Egyptian identities, but now they were declaring themselves fully Egyptian, fully pharaonic. The marriage transformed both partners. Ptolemy II became Ptolemy Philadelphus, the brother lover, a title that was both description and boast. Arsinoe became Arsinoe Philadelphus, the sister wife who shared in the divine authority of the pharaoh. Together, they were the Theoi Adelphoi, the sibling-loving gods who ruled Egypt as Isis and Osiris ruled the underworld. But the transformation was more than ceremonial. Arsinoe brought to the marriage decades of experience in the deadly game of Hellenistic politics. She had survived the courts of Lysimachus and Cyrannus, had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had learned the art of survival in a world where weakness meant death. Now, for the first time in her life, she was in a position to use that knowledge without fear. The new queen threw herself into the work of government with an energy that amazed her subjects. She accompanied Ptolemy on his tours of the kingdom, helping to settle disputes and manage the complex relationships between the various ethnic groups that made up Egypt's population. She patronized the arts and sciences, continuing the tradition of intellectual patronage that had made Alexandria the center of learning in the ancient world. Her greatest contribution was in the realm of foreign policy. domesticate the Hellenistic world, was more dangerous than ever, with new powers rising to challenge the old order. The Romans were expanding in the western Mediterranean, while the Parthians were pressing against the eastern borders of the Seleucid Empire. Ptolemaic needed to navigate these treacherous waters with skill and cunning. Arsinoe understood the importance of divine imagery in projecting power. Under her influence, the royal couple began to appear on coins and monuments as gods, their images associated with the traditional deities of Egypt. They were shown receiving offerings from the people, blessing the land with their divine presence, maintaining the cosmic order through their sacred union. The policy worked. Egypt's subjects, both Greek and Egyptian, began to see their rulers not just as foreign conquerors, but as legitimate pharaohs, inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. The divine marriage had given the Ptolemies something that no other Hellenistic dynasty possessed, a claim to authority that was both political and religious, both Greek and Egyptian, but the personal cost was enormous. Arsinoe had sacrificed everything: her first marriage, her children, her youth, to reach this position. Sia, and endured decades of exile and betrayal, had watched her sons murdered before her eyes, had fled for her life across the Mediterranean. Now, in the twilight of her life, she had achieved the ultimate prize, a share in divine authority, a place among the gods themselves. The marriage produced no children, but it didn't need to. Ptolemy II already had heirs from his first marriage, and Arsinoe was now past childbearing age. What mattered was not biological reproduction, but political and religious transformation. The Ptolemies had become something new, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human authority. As Arsinoe stood in the palace of Alexandria, wearing the crown of the pharaohs, she must have reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been a pawn in her father's diplomatic games, a trophy wife to an aging king, a victim of her half-brother's murderous ambition. But she had also been a player in her own right, a woman who had used every tool available to her: beauty, intelligence, ruthlessness, and sheer determination to survive and ultimately triumph. The tradition she established would outlast her by centuries. Future Ptolemaic rulers would follow her example, marrying their siblings to maintain the divine authority of the dynasty. The practice would reach its culmination in the most famous of all Ptolemaic queens, Cleopatra VII, who married two of her brothers in succession and used the prestige of her divine ancestry to challenge Rome itself. But that is a story for another day. For now, as we watch Arsinoe in a moment of triumph, we must marvel at the price she paid for power and the ruthless, pure determination that carried her through decades of suffering to this final vindication. She had been forced into incest, not once but twice, had been used as a tool of dynastic policy from childhood to middle age. But in the end, she had transformed that victimization into victory, that suffering into strength. The woman who had once cowered in a Macedonian palace, as her children were murdered, now stood as a goddess in the land of the pharaohs, her authority unchallenged, her legacy secure. She had paid the ultimate price for power, but she had also achieved the ultimate reward, immortality. Not just in the memory of historians, but in the religious traditions of the people she ruled. As the sun set over the Nile, casting long shadows across the palace gardens, Arsinoe must have felt a deep satisfaction. She had survived the unsurvivable, had triumphed over impossible odds, had transformed herself from victim to goddess. The girl who had been sold into marriage at 15 had become the woman who redefined what it meant to be a Ptolemaic queen. The bloodline would continue, preserved not through her own children, but through the institutions she had created. The practice of royal incest, once shocking and unprecedented, would become the defining characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And future queens would look back to her as the founder of their traditions, the woman who had shown them that Survival was possible even in the most desperate circumstances. But the cost, the terrible, heartbreaking cost, would never be forgotten. The tragic irony was complete. In seeking to preserve her humanity through the protection of her children, she had been forced to sacrifice her humanity to become a god. In fighting to remain a mother, she had been compelled to become a myth. Kana, the woman who had wanted nothing more than to protect her family, had ended up founding a tradition that would consume countless families in the centuries to come. As night fell over Alexandria, the city settled into the rhythm that would define it for the next 3 centuries. In the palace, the divine couple performed their sacred duties, maintaining the cosmic order through their union. In the temples, priests offered prayers for the health and prosperity of the Toya Adolphoi. In the streets, merchants and scholars, farmers and fishermen went about their lives under the protection of gods who had once been human. And somewhere in the shadows of memory, the ghosts of 2 murdered boys played in the gardens of their childhood, their laughter echoing across the centuries like a reminder of the price that power always demands. The tradition Arsinoe had established would outlive her, but it would never escape the blood that had watered his roots. The story was far from over. The Ptolemaic dynasty would continue for another 2.5 centuries, producing rulers who would be remembered as some of the most brilliant and most depraved in human history. But they would all trace their traditions back to this moment, to this woman, to this terrible and necessary transformation of victim into goddess. The years that followed the divine marriage were a study in the complex dance between power and its price. Arsinoe, too, now in her 40s, threw herself into the role of Pharaoh Queen with the fervor of someone who understood that this might be her last chance to leave a lasting mark on history. She had learned from her previous marriages that survival meant more than simply enduring. It meant becoming indispensable. The royal couple's first major test came with the outbreak of the First Syrian War in 274 BCE. The Seleucid Empire, still reeling from the chaos following Seleucus's murder, was being torn apart by rival claimants to the throne. Antiochus I, the legitimate heir, found himself challenged by pretenders and rebellious governors who saw opportunity in the empire's weakness. For Egypt, this presented both danger and opportunity, the chance to reclaim territories lost to Seleucus, but also the risk of being drawn into a costly conflict. Arsinoe proved invaluable in these deliberations. Her experience with the courts of both Lysimachus and Cyrannus had taught her to read the subtle currents of interdynastic politics. She understood how ambitious generals thought, how they calculated risk and reward, how they could be manipulated or defeated. When Ptolemy II wavered between caution and aggression, she provided the decisive counsel that would shape Egypt's strategy for decades to come. "Strike now," she told her brother husband as they stood on the palace balcony overlooking Alexandria's harbor, watching the war galleys prepare for departure. "Antiochus is weak, his empire fractured, but weakness is temporary. Give him time and he will consolidate his power. Strike now while he bleeds from a dozen wounds." Her words carried the weight of bitter experience. She had seen what happened to those who waited too long, who hesitated when fortune offered her gifts. Lysimachus had hesitated before dealing with Agathocles, and that hesitation had cost him everything. Cyrannus had struck swiftly when he murdered Seleucus, but then had grown complacent, allowing his enemies to organize against him. The lesson was clear. In the world of Hellenistic politics, timing was everything. The war that followed validated her counsel. Egyptian forces swept through Palestine and southern Syria, reclaiming territories that had been lost for decades. Cities that had groaned under Seleucid taxation welcomed the Ptolemaic armies as liberators. Arsinoe herself accompanied some of these campaigns, her presence serving both to inspire the troops and to ensure that the victories were properly consolidated. But It was not just military strategy where Arsinoe excelled. She understood something that many of her contemporaries missed: the importance of narrative, of controlling how power was perceived and remembered. Under her influence, the royal court became a center of artistic and literary production, unlike anything seen since the days of Pericles in Athens. Poets like Theocritus were commissioned to write verses comparing the royal couple to Zeus and Hera, emphasizing the divine nature of their union while making it palatable to Greek sensibilities. Even as Zeus, the king of the immortals, loves Hera, his sister wife, wrote Theocritus, so does Ptolemy love his bride. The comparison was deliberate and calculated. If the king of the gods could marry his sister, then surely mortal pharaohs could do the same. But Arsinoe was careful to balance Greek and Egyptian sensibilities. In the temples along the Nile, she and Ptolemy were depicted as Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings whose union maintained cosmic order. The hieroglyphic inscriptions spoke of their marriage in terms that had been sacred for millennia, emphasizing continuity with the pharaonic past rather than innovation or foreign influence. The queen's influence extended into every aspect of court life. She reformed the royal household, establishing new ceremonies and protocols that emphasized the divine status of the ruling couple. She patronized the Great Library, ensuring that scholars from across the Mediterranean came to Alexandria to study and teach. She oversaw the construction of magnificent temples and public buildings that proclaimed Ptolemaic power to both subjects and foreign visitors. Perhaps most importantly, she began the process of integrating her stepchildren, Ptolemy II's children, from his first marriage to the new order. The crown prince, who would become Ptolemy III, was only a child when his father divorced his mother to marry Arsinoe. But the new queen was careful to show him honor and affection, understanding that her own security depended on his eventual loyalty. "You are the future of this dynasty," she told the young prince during one of their private conversations. "Your father and I are but guardians of the throne until you are ready to claim it. Remember that power is not inherited. It is earned day by day, decision by decision. The gods may have made you a prince, but only your own actions can make you a king." These were lessons born of her own bitter experience. She had seen too many royal children grow up believing that their birth entitled them to rule, only to discover that the world cared nothing for their bloodline if they lacked the strength to defend it. The boy who would become Ptolemy III absorbed these teachings, and they would serve him well when his time came to rule. As the years passed, Arsinoe found herself taking on roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. She attended meetings of the royal council, where her voice carried as much weight as any general or administrator. She received foreign ambassadors, her knowledge of languages and customs proving invaluable in negotiations. She even took part in religious ceremonies traditionally performed only by the pharaoh, sharing in the sacred duties that maintained Egypt's relationship with the gods. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had once been a pawn in her father's diplomatic games had become a player of equivalent rank to any ruler in the Mediterranean world. Foreign kings sought her favor, knowing that her influence with Ptolemy II was absolute. Scholars dedicated their works to her, recognizing her as a patron worthy of immortal verse. The people of Egypt worshipped her as a goddess, believing that her divine blessing ensured the fertility of their fields and the prosperity of their cities. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Arsinoe's reign was the precedent she established for future Ptolemaic queens. Before her marriage to Ptolemy II, royal women in the Hellenistic world were important primarily as mothers and diplomatic assets. They might wield considerable behind-the-scenes influence, but they rarely held formal power or official titles. Arsinoe changed all of that. She created the template for what scholars would later call Ptolemaic queenship, a model of female rule that combined traditional Egyptian concepts of divine kingship with Hellenistic ideas about royal authority. Future queens, like Cleopatra, 7, would build on the foundation she laid, but they would always acknowledge her as the originator of their power. The irony was not lost on those who knew her story. The woman who had been forced into incestuous marriages as a victim of male political calculations had transformed those very marriages into sources of unprecedented female authority. She had taken the chains that bound her and forged them into a crown. As Arsinoe entered her 50s, she began to contemplate her legacy. She had no children of her own to carry on her bloodline, but she had created something perhaps more lasting, an institution, a tradition, a way of being queen that would endure long after her death. The practice of sibling marriage that had begun with her union to Ptolemy II would become the defining characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty, setting them apart from all other Hellenistic rulers. She established a cult in her own honor, something unprecedented for a living queen. Temples were built where she was worshipped as a goddess. Festivals were instituted to celebrate her divine marriage. Statues were created to maintain her sacred rites. These were not merely expressions of royal vanity. They were carefully calculated moves to ensure that her innovations would survive her death. The end came in 270 BCE, when Arsinoe was 46 years old. The cause of her death is lost to history, perhaps illness, perhaps poison, perhaps simply the accumulated toll of a life lived at the highest levels of stress and danger. What matters is not how she died, but what she accomplished in life. Her funeral was a spectacle worthy of a pharaoh. The procession wound through the streets of Alexandria for days, with representatives from across the Mediterranean world coming to pay their respects. Poets recited verses in her honor. Priests performed ceremonies in multiple languages. And the people of Egypt mourned the loss of their divine queen. But even death could not diminish her influence. Ptolemy II, bereft of his partner and co-ruler, established an eternal cult in her honor. She was officially deified as Arsinoe Philadelphus, the brother-loving goddess, and her worship was incorporated into the state religion of Egypt. Temples across the kingdom maintained her sacred fires, and her image appeared on coins and monuments for centuries to come. More importantly, the tradition she had established continued. Future Ptolemaic rulers followed her example, marrying their siblings to maintain the divine character of their authority. The practice became so integral to the dynasty that it was impossible to imagine Ptolemaic rule without it. Each successive generation of sibling marriages was a tribute to her memory, a recognition that she had found the key to legitimacy in a world of competing claims and divided loyalties. The tragic irony of her story was complete. The woman who had been victimized by the practice of dynastic marriage had transformed that same practice, into a source of unprecedented female authority. She had been forced into incest by the political calculations of men, but she had made incest into a tool for transcending the men, limitations that those same men had tried to impose on her as the centuries passed and the Ptolemaic dynasty eventually fell to Roman conquest. Historians would debate the morality and wisdom of the tradition Arsinoe had established. Some would condemn the practice of sibling marriage as a corruption of natural law, a sign of decadence that inevitably led to the dynasty's downfall. Others would recognize it as a brilliant adaptation to the unique circumstances of Hellenistic Egypt. It's a way of maintaining legitimacy in a world of competing claims and divided loyalties. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Arsinoe, too, came from an unexpected source. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and began his affair with Cleopatra VII, he was amazed by the young queen's confidence and authority. How does she carry herself with such divine assurance? He reportedly asked one of his advisors. The answer was simple. She was the heir to a tradition that stretched back nearly 3 centuries. To a woman who had transformed victimization into victory, suffering into strength, chains into crowns. Cleopatra ruled as she did because Arsinoe, too, had shown her how, had created the template for Ptolemaic queenship that made such authority possible. In the end, that may be the most remarkable aspect of Arsinoe's story. She began as a pawn in other people's games, a victim of forces beyond her control, but through intelligence, determination, and an almost superhuman capacity for survival, she transformed herself into something unprecedented in the ancient world. A woman who ruled not just through marriage or motherhood, but through her own merit and authority. The cost had been enormous. She had sacrificed her children, her youth, her peace of mind, and ultimately her humanity to achieve this transformation. She had been forced to become a goddess because being merely human was not enough to ensure survival in the world she inhabited. But the achievement was equally enormous. She had created a new model of female power, had shown that even in the most patriarchal of societies, a woman of sufficient determination could transcend the limitations imposed on her gender. She had proven that victimization need not be permanent, that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed into opportunities for greatness. As the sun set over the Nile on the day of her funeral, casting long shadows across the temples where she would be worshipped for centuries to come, the mourners dispersed to their homes, carrying with them the memory of a queen unlike any other. She had been the woman forced into incest by her own father's political ambitions. But she had also been the woman who transformed those very ambitions into a source of power that would echo through the ages. The bloodline she had sought so desperately to preserve through her own children lived on instead through the institution she had created. Every future Ptolemaic queen who married her brother, every ceremony that proclaimed the divine nature of royal incest, every coin that bore the image of sibling rulers, all were monuments to her memory, testaments to the price she had paid and the victory she had won in death as in life. Arsinoe to Philadelphus remained what she had always been, a woman who refused to accept the limitations others sought to impose on her, who transformed every chain into a crown, every defeat into a stepping stone to greater power. She had been the victim who became the goddess, the pawn who became the queen, the woman who showed the world that even incest, the ultimate symbol of powerlessness and exploitation, could be transformed into a source of strength. Her story was over, but her legacy would endure until the last Ptolemaic pharaoh fell to Roman swords and the dynasty she had helped create finally passed into history. Even then, her influence would survive in the memories of historians and the imagination of poets. A reminder that human beings are capable of transforming even the most horrific circumstances into sources of meaning, purpose, and power. The queen, forced into incest by her own father, had become the goddess who redefined what it meant to be queen. In the end, perhaps that was victory enough.